You know, we all love a good sci-fi epic, right? But what are they actually made of? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the secret ingredients that go into building a modern saga. And yeah, we're going to use one of the biggest of all time, Star Wars, as our guide to figure out its blueprint.
Oof, chilling, isn't it? That single line from Padme Amidala, it just captures the exact moment a democracy crumbles into tyranny. It's got to be one of the most powerful scenes in the whole saga, this moment of pure political horror, just disguised with spaceships and aliens. But what if I told you it wasn't really fiction at all?
So that's the big question we're tackling. We're about to do a deep dive to find the blueprint. You know, the hidden architecture behind a galaxy far, far away. And you might be surprised to find out that the answer is a lot closer to home than you think. Okay, our first ingredient is probably the most surprising one: real-world history. The whole political drama of the Star Wars prequels, it wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It was directly inspired by the very real and very tragic collapse of a government in 20th century Europe. Check this out. On the left, you've got Germany's Weimar Republic. That's the government that rose up from the ashes of World War I and, well, eventually gave way to the Nazi Party. And on the right, the Galactic Republic from Star Wars. It's kind of crazy how their stories of collapse are so shockingly similar. Both were these fragile democracies, and both fell prey to a single, ambitious figure who just exploited all their internal divisions to seize absolute power.
I mean, the parallels here are just uncanny. Both systems were led by a chancellor. Both were totally fractured by social conflict. You had communists versus capitalists in Weimar Germany. You had the wealthy core worlds versus the outer rim in the Republic. And get this, peace wasn't kept by some huge army, but by these specialized groups: paramilitary forces in Germany, the Jedi Knights in space. And in both cases, a tyrant rose to power by exploiting a crisis he helped create. For Hitler, it was the Reichstag fire. For Palpatine, it was the assassination attempts on Senator Amidala.
And here's the kicker. Both republics had the exact same fatal flaw in their design. Their systems made it way too easy for small extremist groups to get a foothold in government. With no real barriers to entry, fringe parties could win seats, gain legitimacy, and, well, eventually tear down the whole system from the inside. In both cases, democracy accidentally created the very tools of its own destruction. But history is just one piece of the puzzle. For our second ingredient, we've got to look at how these sagas are actually built. See, great sci-fi doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's part of this massive conversation between creators that stretches back decades.
I love this quote from a Reddit discussion because it just perfectly reframes how creative influence works. It's not about stealing, it's a conversation. Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune, he read Isaac Asimov's Foundation, and he didn't just copy it. No, he responded to it, he challenged its ideas, and he built his own universe in a dialogue with it.
And you can see that conversation happening right here on this timeline. Asimov's Foundation kicks things off in 1951. 14 years later, Herbert's Dune joins the chat. Then, 12 years after that, George Lucas comes along and synthesizes elements from both of them to create Star Wars. See, each masterpiece is basically standing on the shoulders of giants. The overlaps between Foundation and Dune are just incredible. I mean, both have a galactic imperium. They both have personal energy shields, a naive emperor who's super easy to manipulate, and a central figure with these extraordinary mental powers who can literally change history. It just goes to show you Herbert wasn't just inspired by Asimov, he was actively responding to his world building. Okay, so we've got history and we've got art, but our third ingredient is way more modern. And let's be honest, maybe a little more cynical: corporate strategy. Because in this day and age, the fate of a galaxy sometimes isn't decided by a hero, but in a boardroom. $4.05 billion. In 2012, this is the number that changed the Star Wars universe forever. Disney bought Lucasfilm for over $4 billion, and with that purchase came the power to just reshape the entire galactic timeline. And that purchase led to what fans call the Great Split. All of a sudden, there were two Star Wars timelines. Canon became the official story. That's all the films and any new stuff published after 2014. Everything else, we're talking decades of beloved books and comics, got rebranded as legends. Basically, it all became official fan fiction. This timeline really shows you just how huge that 2014 decision was. For over 35 years, fans had this whole shared universe of stories that continued on after the original movies ended. But, you know, to make way for a new trilogy, Disney needed a clean slate. So with one strategic move, they pruned decades of established history.
You have to understand, for millions of fans, stories like Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy, they weren't just books, they were the sequel to Return of the Jedi. The stories of Han and Leia's kids, Luke's new Jedi Order, Grand Admiral Thrawn, this wasn't some what if. This was the accepted future of the galaxy.
And then, with one corporate decision, it was all reclassified. What was once the official future became this compelling alternate history. It's a pretty powerful reminder that modern storytelling is also a business, and sometimes the narrative has to serve the bottom line. So we've covered history, art, and business. Our final ingredient comes from inside the lore itself. We're diving into one of the most passionate, longest-running debates in all of science fiction, a single creative choice that really gets to the very heart of what makes Star Wars, well, Star Wars.
This right here, this is the question that has divided the fandom since 1999. Is the Force a spiritual power that pretty much anyone can tap into with enough belief and training, or is it something you're just born with, like a genetic lottery ticket you can measure in your blood?
See, the original trilogy gave us that mystical definition on the left. It was beautiful, kind of vague, philosophical, spiritual. But then the prequel trilogy came along and introduced the idea of midichlorians, these microscopic life forms that act as a conduit to the Force. A higher count means a stronger connection. It basically turned magic into science.
And this creative choice was explosive. For some people, it totally demystified the Force, boiling its spiritual depth down to a simple blood test. For others, it was this fascinating expansion of the lore. But that tension between what we explain and what we leave to the imagination, that's a powerful engine for fan engagement. It keeps the conversation going, and it keeps the universe alive.
So, there we have it. We've uncovered the hidden ingredients, we've got the secret formula. Now let's put these pieces together and see the complete blueprint for a modern myth. When you put it all together, the blueprint for a saga like Star Wars becomes pretty clear. First, you anchor your fantastic story in real, resonant history. Second, you join the conversation with the great works that came before you. Third, you have to adapt to the realities of the business world. And finally, and this might be the most important, you make creative choices that spark debate and turn your audience into a passionate, invested community. Ultimately, these stories we love so much feel magical, but they're meticulously constructed. They're these complex tapestries woven together from the very real threads of our own world. Our history, our art, our businesses, and our own endless debates about what it all means. So that's the question I want to leave you with. Now that you've seen how the sausage is made, does it change the flavor? Does understanding the architecture behind the myth take away some of the magic for you, or does it add a whole new layer of appreciation for the incredible balancing act it takes to build a universe? Something to think about.